Seeff, with expertise built through generations of trust.
Vengai Madzima is the senior partner at Madzima Mseta Legal Practitioners, commonly known as MCM Legal. My background is solidly in property, both intellectual property and land law. I've got a master's in comparative business law, and I was focusing mainly on issues to do with commercial leases and intellectual property from an academic perspective. I've written for a local newspaper for 4 years on property investments, which included, among other things, issues to do with leases. A lease is ultimately a term contract between a lessor and a leasee, which is the person who's offering the property to be leased and the person who needs the property to be leased for certain use. That is what it is. It contains within it covenants or clauses or provisions that have been agreed between the two parties on how they want that relationship to be maintained. The key terms in a lease really are lessor, which is the person who's offering the property to be leased, the leasee being the person who wants to use the property for a term period, the term, which is ultimately the duration of the lease, the consideration, which is the value that is going to be paid for the use of this thing, and your exit clauses on how you want the lease to be terminated. The lease agreement, to give a background, is the agreement between the parties that relates to the specific thing that is to be leased. This document is very important, and we find in our industry that people use precedents per se as a one-size-fits-all for all lease agreements. Well, personally, I'm totally against this because every agreement or every leasing relationship is unique and should be drafted to accord with the requirements of that particular relationship. You will find the precedents that one uses will relate to a relationship or a prior relationship which attends to the issues that were emanating from that particular relationship. So the lease agreement, in short, is a contract between two parties on how their relationship during the term of the lease is to be managed. It will include within it restrictive clauses of what cannot be done. It would include within it permitted clauses on what is permitted, and obviously it will include within it the parameters of the lease. To what extent can you use the particular property? Well, the pre-drafting clauses firstly is to capture the lessor, who is renting this property, the leasee, who is going to be renting this property going forward, the term, what duration is this relationship going to be, the consideration, which is the amount, how much are they going to be paying, if there is a review clause, at what interviews and instances are you going to be reviewing the rentals, any restricted covenants, what is restricted or what cannot be done within this leasing relationship. You also have your arbitration or alternative dispute resolution clauses. What happens when there's a dispute within the leasing relationship? How is that dispute resolved? Those, to me, at first instance or first glance, are the most pertinent clauses in a lease. So in layman's terms or in layman's language, we can say the most important clauses there will be your names. The names are captured correctly with your identity details. And phone numbers, they become very important. You also have your period of the lease, how long the lease is going to last. It's very important because it should have an end. It cannot be indefinite. You also have your rental amounts. What is the rent that's going to be paid on that piece of property? It has to be a specific amount. And then obviously you find with these leases that somebody would want to have an increment of rent or to have the rent decreased at a certain point depending on what's happening in the market. So you should then have your rent review clause in there to say at what point do we increase the rent or at what point do we decrease the rent. I mean, review should ultimately go both ways. And then you have your permitted use clauses, which are what are you allowed to do with the property that you have been given. To what extent can you do? If it's a commercial property, for instance, you'll be allowed use of a certain area and then you are not allowed use of other areas. If it's a residential property, some instances you have use of the whole property and you're not allowed use of the cottage. So those are things that are then captured within the lease agreement. And also what happens when there's a dispute in the lease. How do you address the dispute? Do you go to court? Do you find somebody to mediate, or do you go to an arbitrator? Those clauses are then captured within the lease agreement. I'll start with the lease agreement. A properly drafted lease agreement would then have your dispute resolution methods, and there are three. There is arbitration, which is done through an arbitrator appointed by a body. You will find that the arbitrator may be appointed by the Estate Agents Council, the arbitrator may be appointed by the Law Society, or the arbitrator may be appointed by the Commercial Arbitration Board. The arbitrator, their decision ultimately is captured in the leases, is final. It can be taken to the High Court on review, but you have a binding decision coming from an arbitrator. Or you can have mediation, where you invite another estate agent or somebody recommended by the Estate Agents Council to come and mediate the dispute. Their decisions ultimately are not binding, but they are persuasive if the parties want to maintain the relationship. Or you can then approach our courts, be it the Magistrates Court or the High Court, and their decision, as you will know, are binding. My answer to that is very simple, because I've used Seeff to manage my properties. I think when my first flat was actually managed by Seeff, and I was getting a very good rental from it, because one, they're able to get through a due diligence process, they're able to get the right tenant to come into the property. And this is very key. Sometimes we only look at the issue to do with the financial returns, but your property preservation, having the right tenant coming in, and also having a tenant that is there for a long period will help preserve the property. You also have instances, or you would want an agent that will come to the property to ensure that what you have requested from the agent to do is done. That is issues to do with maintenance. If you have a pool, if the pool is maintained, if you have lawn on your property, if it is kept manicured, because you do not want your property to lose value while it's being leased. And this is the problem that we face, or the complaints that we get even as lawyers from property owners that have put their properties with estate agents, that the period the property was being leased, it lost value. You actually want that period, within that period, for your property to gain value. And it all depends on how the estate agent is managing that piece of property.
Seeff, with expertise built through generations of trust. Home is our story.